It's really exciting to be back in my home community and to share some ideas with you. It's a bit intimidating for me, so I'm not sure how it must feel for you to look at the agenda for this morning and realize that you've got me in part or whole for the whole bloody morning. So I know I will be tired of myself by noontime. I can't imagine what it's going to be like for you guys. So my hope is that through this day, we actually have a chance to really get an exchange of ideas that don't just come from the front of the room, but come from different parts of the room in the discussions that we have. I've been enormously impressed with the agenda that has been set up and the speakers and the topics that you've covered already. I wish I was here for the first part of this, but other commitments sort of kept me from being here the whole time. I'm gonna, is this volume?
Yeah.
Can you hear me at the back very well? Okay. We're getting no's to the left and yeses to the right. There's a fan noise, okay. And so maybe I should, is it a little better if I speak into it like this? Sorry, I'm getting right up to the mic. Holy bloody, okay, let me just take this out. Is this better? Okay. Okay, I feel like Geraldo. Phil Donahue. How much time do I have, Phil? I can get to really enjoy this. I'm going to be up and down the aisles and sitting on people's laps. And this is going to be a lot of fun. So anyway, one of the things that I recognize is that there is tremendous wisdom in this room and as part of the content, and tremendous experience. And I'm not a community economic development person. I've been sniffing around the edges of aspects of this and social enterprise, social impact bonds, rural-urban kind of issues. Engagement is the main focus. You're going to learn that in a second. My passion for Nova Scotia and Cape Breton are really important issues for me. That'll hopefully be revealed here. So for some of you, you're far more informed about the overall thrust of what this conference is about than I am. But I have a number of things that I really appreciate having a chance to share about the direction of our province. But I'm going to, the outline of my remarks are going to be kind of in three different pieces. I'd like to begin sharing in a way that I haven't at any other time, and I'm not sure how it's going to land for you, and I'm not even sure where it's going, around some personal reflections about some compelling ideas that challenge the status quo. Something that perhaps in some ways we have in common is that we have, Phil had mentioned some of the work that I've done in the past, and some of it has involved sort of challenging the status quo of where we've gone. And I'd just like to share with you a few thoughts with respect to that. Then I'd like to talk to you about citizen engagement and Engage Nova Scotia specifically. So for that part of my remarks, I apologize for those of you who aren't from Nova Scotia, who will see this as Nova Scotia-centric, but I hope that to some extent it informs the questions and conversations that you have if you're from outside Nova Scotia. I think there are universal elements to what we're trying to do in this area. And it's going to include aspects of some research that we've done at Engage Nova Scotia in order to sort of hack into the mindset of Nova Scotians about their relationship with this province in general. And then hopefully the richest part of the whole thing will be a period of questions and answers that we cycle through in general. So let me start with the new part for me, and that relates to some of those personal reflections. I mentioned that I grew up on Whitney Avenue. For those of you from Sydney, you'd know where that is. There used to be a city hospital that was right across the street from the place where I grew up. And I think everyone would have known my father was in public life, and so I grew up in a liberal family. And so, as Cape Breton would have it, once born into a liberal family, you're always considered to be a liberal. Never mind that I voted NDP and Rhino, and I hacked up my ballot for much of my adult life because of my discouragement about the state of politics in federally and politically. I was born into a liberal family. I challenged the status quo around the dining room table about politics and the dominant culture that sort of rallied around those sorts of issues, but nonetheless really couldn't quite break out of the bonds of what that would be. And as Phil mentioned, I eventually became the leader of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party, and that happened only after the first political meeting I ever attended was one to determine, as an adult, was one with the question of whether or not I would run for the leadership of the Bloody Party in the first place. So I was a total rookie to politics, and I make no apologies whatsoever, and am proud of the people and the party with whom I ran at that particular time. But it wasn't a typical sort of coming up through the ranks in the sense of just carrying the colors blindly without sort of asking some questions at different times in all of this. And on my way to that, I started as a corporate lawyer with a big law firm, and then realized that's not why I went to law school. So I left that firm to become a legal aid lawyer, because I thought the main reasons why I wanted to go to law school was to help people who were disadvantaged, economically at least. So my work with Nova Scotia Legal Aid was really informative for me, but it also led me to some work in restorative justice. And restorative justice, for some of you who might not know, is informed by all of our traditions. The one that's most visible for many of us is our Aboriginal traditions here in North America, where we bring together people around the challenges of victim and offender reconciliation with a wider community that is involved in it. Really something that runs counter to the dominant culture in criminal justice around punishment, retribution, courts, prosecutions, and jails. So that process of being involved, that was much of the work that I did for a long period of time. And much of the time when I was doing that, I felt like we in the restorative justice world were like a health food store on a side street, while the big supermarkets were open on the main streets and selling to everybody. And I thought, man, we've got this compelling story about how you can do things differently and better, but nobody seems to be listening or hearing what it is that we're talking about. And to some extent, I'm sharing these thoughts in part because I'm left wondering about community economic development and social enterprise, social impact, and whether or not, to some extent, there is a question that needs to be held about whether or not the work that is happening here, as compelling as it is, too much of an extent isn't finding its way onto Main Street and is remaining that health food store on a side street. And with all of the incredible work that's being done and the examples that you have seen from around the world, and I'm familiar with in a general sense, about just how much more compelling it is to do things local and to find other ways of making sure that our economies are strong and healthy, we still remain in a culture where the narrative is something that's dominated by the Wall Street Journal and other economic views that don't necessarily have the kind of credibility and warrant the level of reverence that they sometimes have. So this is the parallel that I'm inviting you to consider about the work that I've done in the world of restorative justice, and perhaps some of the work that you've done in the work that you've done. When I was in politics, I talked about citizen-centered democracy, and I campaigned to reverse a tax cut. I'm not sure how often that happens, but there was a 10% tax cut that was promised by the government in 2003, and we said, actually, we're going to reverse it, and we're going to take money back. Anyway, it wasn't a typical sort of approach to politics, and perhaps the fact that my period of time in politics lasted only for a small segment of my life is a reflection of what that means. When I left public life, and it was a really rich experience. There's a unique experience about being a political leader. Everybody's looking for appointments and meetings with you because they think there's some chance that you might become the premier of the province. So I was introduced to every aspect of people's thoughts and feelings and aspirations around this province. And I eventually became concerned that the narrative, if you will, is one that's driven by those alpha male dominant groups, the cut and thrust group that sort of continues to sort of control what the story is about how we emerge as Nova Scotians and whether or not we make our way forward through one means or another. And when I left, I was inspired to become involved in starting an initiative called Envision Halifax. So it was relatively modest, but it was essentially, if you could imagine this metaphor for me, it involved a bridge. And that bridge related to having more of those alpha males, for lack of a better word, guys like, privileged, people who don't struggle to make ends meet every month kind of world, whether we needed more of these people to sort of come across the bridge to a new age understanding of how we can be more authentic and open-minded to all of these really groovy ideas that we wanted. So Envision Halifax was an absolute passion of mine. We had leadership programs that lasted for a number of years, and it was really exciting, and it created some fundamental changes. But in the time since then, and this is really at the heart of why I'm this short soliloquy, not so short, sort of thought process is coming to mind, is that metaphor for me about the fact that, damn it, I just want more of those people who are screwing it up to figure out how I've got it right in this new age world. If they just more of them would come across the bridge, we'll all be a better place. And what I've come to consider in the time that I'm sort of working through this is that, yeah, absolutely, more of them need to come there. But as well, many of my friends and colleagues who are in the new age space, who are in that authentic, open-minded kind of space, also need to come to understand the wisdom and the possibilities that exist from the place that the other side sort of holds dearly to each other. So that bridge that I'm describing is one that in some respects cuts both ways. Most of the traffic needs to go from that really crowded place to the place of new possibilities. But it also, and this is the invitation for those of us who are innovators, it also needs to go back out to the other place. So we need to, the last time I was at Cape Breton University, I was able to share a talk about the possibility that those least like us have the most to teach us. And the greatest challenge for that comes to the people who come to things with new ideas from a disadvantaged kind of place. So if you think about where you are right now and consider, man, if only those other folks would figure out how I've got it right, consider whether or not there's another way of looking at that. That you too, as terrific as your ideas are, have something to learn from somebody else. That's been part of my learning, and I hope it's been somewhat meaningful. Because it invites for me this first question for all of us. And I would, in any room that I am in, ask this question: who's not in the room? Who needs to be part fully of the conversations that you are having in order for this to become full, real, and total for all of the people who really matter to us? So my belief is that when we are all together, when everyone is included, from a place of empowerment and disempowerment, everyone's in the conversation, we're going to get to places that we haven't been able to get to from before. And it's why I am so deeply committed to this notion of engaging people across difference to come together around new ideas, as difficult as it often is. There's a book that I have sometimes referenced by a fellow by the name of James Surowiecki called The Wisdom of Crowds. And the thesis of this book is that And this is for me a rather profound consideration that really comes out of the notions related to Joseph Howe here in Nova Scotia, is that the great unwashed, the collective aggregate of all of us, is wiser and better able to anticipate the future and make good decisions than the elite few. It's a transformative idea that really is at the heart of what democracy is about at its very core. When we got the right to vote, consider the chaos that would have happened as a result of people having this opportunity to vote. I mean, control was in the minds, was in the hands of the people who were educated, of course, and really knew better for everybody else. But perhaps the greatest invention that was created in the last 100 years was the spread of democracy itself. The possibility that the great unwashed are actually wiser than the collective few who are well informed. So my belief is that the vote is just the Model T. It's the beginning of what deep democracy really is. And the next step for us as a society and as a citizenry is to become engaged between elections and to own the possibilities of what it means to be an active, engaged citizen between elections. All we do right now that really matters too often is go to a ballot box once every 4 years and mark an X. It can be so much more than that. So that was at the heart of what Joe Howe talked about when he provided perhaps the greatest innovation that Nova Scotia has ever exported to the rest of the world and to the British Commonwealth when he talked about representative government. Now, this has happened for a period of time where a select few have really controlled what has happened. But something has happened in the last year and a half that I think has begun to sort of change the conversation. And for some people, this fella here is indeed a saint. So the guy, he grew up just down the road here on Grand Lake Road, Ray Ivany. And the Ivany Commission report, I suspect, given the depth and breadth with which it's been repeated, will become a potentially iconic signature point for us as Nova Scotians. And I am completely confident that it is an incomplete report. And I know that there are many, including undoubtedly people who are here, who would see this report as too much of a neoconservative recycling of old ideas. And for some people, they see this report as something new. What is clearest to me is that it has started a conversation amongst us all, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it. What's bubbling up around water coolers and at soccer pitches and at Tim Hortons is a conversation about our future like we've never had it before. Ray called us out and said, we've got some fixing to do. And people are responding by saying, I don't think you're pointing in the right direction, or I think you have, and let's get on with it. But most important, it started this conversation. And there are three things that they talked about in that particular report. The two things that get mentioned most often is the fact that we've got significant economic challenges and we've got significant demographic challenges. But the report also spoke about something else. And this slide that we created is really something that's intended to sort of give you a different feel for what else it was talking about. It talked about the attitude of Nova Scotians. It talked about how we, to a certain extent, seem to be divided, that we're not on the same page as Nova Scotians. And until we get to the psychological barriers of distrust, division, and discouragement, we may not get to where we need to be as Nova Scotians. And a precursor to those economic challenges relates to, well, how do we come together? What's our shared vision? Do we have a common goal? Can we come together? And this was happening at the same time. Engage Nova Scotia actually started before the Ivany Commission began its work. But we were on the same page as it relates to the soil work, sort of the removing the rocks and tilling the soil and finding out, okay, what do we do as Nova Scotians to make things better? So with apologies to those of you who aren't from Nova Scotia, and in the hopes that this is relevant for the work that you're doing in other parts of Canada and elsewhere, I'm going to share with you something about that Nova Scotia experience. It begins with this confused and dazed look that's been, I think, continues in my mind about where do you begin? Okay, I'm not going to walk into Shelburne and say to people, you've got an attitude problem, start fixing it. By the way, I'm from Halifax. You can just imagine what that's going to feel like. But I think that we're starting to bring this into focus. And I think that this relates to, I'm mindful of the people here like Phil who are from the Coady traditions to a certain extent. And when you think about the themes that sort of come through, the best of what the Nova Scotia leaders have done through the generations, Moses Coady and Jimmy Tompkins and these people, I think, recognize that the wisdom and the possibilities rest with us. It rests with the great unwashed citizens if we become engaged. So what does engaged really mean? What does engaged mean for us? Our view is that engaged means that you are willing, informed, and able to face and tackle our social, economic, cultural, political, and environmental challenges. And also see the possibilities in all of this. So I'm of a view that the glass is more than half full when it comes to Nova Scotia. This is a place, and Cape Breton particularly, is a place where it's a cut the crap, look you in the eye, tell you like it is kind of community. With roots in the ground, there's so much that we have that the rest of the world that does better around some economic indicators would love to have in the way that we have it. But there are also challenges that we have. So what do we do to meet the challenges and live up to the full potential of what it means to be a Nova Scotian? I think it means to be willing, informed, and able. And so the work that we've done at Engage Nova Scotia was intended to sort of hack in to the relationship between Nova Scotians and its province. And for many of you from Cape Breton, I got a feeling you may even be sitting here and saying, the province, oh yeah, I'm a Nova Scotian. Because I think of myself as a Cape Bretoner. And that's the first way that you sometimes might think of yourself. So let me share with you a couple of things. First, with respect to being willing, we asked 1,000 Nova Scotians the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm open to changing my thinking and behavior if it means helping Nova Scotia. 87% of those people rated it as a 7 to 10. So great result on our willingness as Nova Scotians to actually step up and do something. Okay, are we informed? Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I believe I'm well informed about Nova Scotia's economic, social, and environmental challenges. A little more mixed review with respect to this. And then it comes to the question of whether or not you feel able. And Nova Scotians in this regard indicated, well, that's where I'm really feeling challenged. And in some respects, I suspect many Nova Scotians feel kind of paralyzed. Where do you begin? Back to that slide where you had the many choices. And so the work that we're trying to do at Engage is to bring people together and try to make something different happen. We see that there is a group. What happened, I think, after the Ivany Commission report is that these reports have been happening for forever. The Ivany kind of reports. But there's something different that happened on this one. Because since the 1930s, people have been talking about the social and economic challenges that we have, but the only people who have been really fussed about it are the insiders, people who follow public policy, government leaders and others. And these reports have collected dust every decade. And every election time we go back to the ballot box and we vote about things like the price of auto insurance. And you'll never find the questions of auto insurance wrapped in any of the reports about the big challenges that we have as Nova Scotians. What you will find instead is that for the first time, we're actually, to the point that I was making earlier about the curious, in the last year and a half, I think we've reached a tipping point in Nova Scotia with respect to the people who are asking themselves questions about where do we go as Nova Scotians. Those people at Tim Hortons are talking in much greater numbers and in deeper fashion about what it means for us to really make our way forward. But when we do that, we're still, to a certain extent, I would suggest, kind of caught in the regions of the province. This is Nova Scotia. And you can decide which part of Nova Scotia you come from. Last night I was in a conversation with business leaders at Dundee who see themselves part of the mainland, part of Cape Breton. They're part of the Strait Area business community. And they see themselves really identified with that Highland region that's spoken of there, and sometimes less connected to the Cape Breton part of what we're doing. The point of it all is that we as Nova Scotians have seen ourselves identified regionally. And I don't for a moment consider this to be necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. But I just invite you to consider this as a result of our inviting Nova Scotians to answer a question on a scale of 10. I generally identify with my region of the province first, then the province overall. So, we're less than 1 million people. For those of you from other parts of the world, you'd appreciate that in countries like China, they'd have 100 cities with more people than our province of Nova Scotia. But we see ourselves in Nova Scotia through this lens of regions more than we see ourselves through a united and single Nova Scotia. And again, I don't want for a minute to diminish this, because the place where I come from, this island, when you break down the regional breakdown of this 71%, it sort of goes kind of off the charts if you're a Cape Bretoner. So Cape Bretoners identify with their region of the province much more than they identify with the province as a whole. And so we asked Nova Scotians as well similar questions about, are we united in our efforts to make the province a better place? And you'll see that the results suggest that across the entire province, there seems to be a concern about whether or not we are united. Sometimes I wonder about whether that's related to our geography. We're not quite an island. We're kind of long and slender, almost like Chile. We cling to the coasts, and we don't seem to get out. Or whether or not it's the Scottish clan system that sort of holds us back into sort of believing that our little pocket of the world has all the answers to a certain extent. But I think that there are things that we need to understand about this that will inform us over a long period of time. So there's lots of good news I think, in the research that we're going to share with Nova Scotians about what moves us forward. And this is one that we deliberately asked of Nova Scotians that I think is relevant, and I hope that you find it meaningful. At the end of the day, when I talk about the quality of life issues that Nova Scotia uniquely has an advantage in, and we're not sharing all of the data here with you today, but people absolutely love this place of Nova Scotia. And we asked them the question of, we should measure Nova Scotia's success by the improvement in the quality of our life, was one question, and right after that was the same question, but we changed quality of life to the growth in our economy. And you'll see that for Nova Scotians at least, the focus isn't just on growing the GDP line. All of us are familiar with the Canadian Index of Well-Being or the OECD measurements of success, the Social Progress Index, and all of these other tools that are used that actually ask in an interest-based kind of way, what are we really after? Are we really just after a bigger, stronger economy? Are we after something different? And so, for the first time, we think that we're asking questions about that relationship with Nova Scotians that at least allow people to sort of say, okay, that's not exactly the goal. The goal is this as well. And we know that, and this is borne out by the research, that an improvement in the quality of life across the world, and by measurements of how citizens feel, is connected to the strength of the economy in these locations. So this isn't for a moment intended to diminish the importance of ensuring that we have a strong and stable economy. It is, however, to invite us to shift our focus to the question of what's the big prize. And Nova Scotians, I think, are fairly strongly saying that the big prize is improved quality of life. So how do we get there? What's that going to happen? And they also believe that Nova Scotia can grow its economy without losing what makes it special. This also was borne out in our in our data. And we asked the question about who's most credible to lead the change, and hopefully the font will bear itself out there. And you'll see that my former profession ranks near the bottom of who's expected to lead this change, elected officials. But what we really found quite striking is that Nova Scotians believe that it's actually on all of us to bring about this change. It's an association of businesses and trade unions and universities and government officials and not-for-profit organizations that are trying to make a difference in some meaningful sort of way. And I think that's the only way that it can likely be. Because since the late 50s and the early 60s, according to this research that was produced in a book called Rescuing Policy, The Case for Public Engagement by Don Lenihan, the trust in institutions generally, and in government in particular, has been dropping precipitously since the early 60s and the late 50s. So even when government comes up with fantastic ideas, it's not going to be as easy to bring forward grand ideas like Medicare, the way that it might have been before, or universal education, which wasn't something we always had, or a progressive tax system. These big ideas that were transformative for us came about at a time when we were frankly more deferential. But we're living in a time where citizens, and this cuts across the United States and Canada, and I suspect that it's comparable with the belief that exists in other parts of the world, where people are saying it's not government that's going to just ride us alone to the promised land. It's us regular folks. It's us citizens that need to take responsibility for what that means. So what does that mean for us as an organization as we have that glazed look and look forward and say, okay, well, how do you begin to tackle all of that sort of work? How do you begin to sort of cycle into some activities that actually mean something for in people's lives at a big level and at a granular level? So how do you change the narrative, but how do you make it a possibility for people in their local community, or even in their local, in their home, in the way that they can do things as individuals? A few months ago, we put out an invitation to Nova Scotians to step up. And some of you might have been a part of the conversations that we started. At the beginning of this initiative that Engage Nova Scotia started, we were hoping that we might be able to get a couple hundred people to gather in one single location to talk about the future of Nova Scotia. And if we had a great conversation, then would be able to sort of make some exciting things happen. Without pressing the send button a second time, there was a flood of people from around the province who said, I'm in. I want to be part of this conversation. And from one end of the province, people said, well, can you have, with the support of the Community Sector Council and folks like Phil and at Cody and people here at CBU and Tanya and others, there was a flood of people who came in and said, I want to be part of this conversation. And so we live streamed. In the end, we ended up with most of our places over capacity, and we had to shut off registration for each of these locations. We ended up with 11 locations. In fact, we had 12 locations, because by the time Chester found out about it, they said, can we, and we said, sorry, we just don't have time logistically to support you. They said, okay, we'll organize it ourselves. Just give us the dial-in button for the live stream, and we'll create a community conversation because we want to be part of it. So it was really 12 communities, and there could have been more because others started to inquire. So 300 people in Halifax, where we probably could have had 600 people at the new library that they had. We had, I'm trying to remember the numbers of people here that we had at CBU who were part of a conversation that so many of you were a part of, that were richly supported. And from one end of the province to another, people had rich conversations, bringing together unlikely allies. So the Chambers of Commerce, the Community Sector Council, and people who aren't normally in these kinds of conversations, having conversation across that difference that I talked about before to say, okay, this is on all of us. Let's make it as inclusive as possible. We ended up with 800 or so official registrants for this, 300 in Halifax, 500 in the communities in each of these locations around Nova Scotia. But then, upon hearing more of it and seeing that registration was full, almost 900 other people joined us online for the day to sort of plug in. We ended up being the highest trending Twitter something or other in Canada on the day that we held this Stepping Up conference, which clearly suggests to us that there's something that was latent in Nova Scotians' desire and willingness to step up and build the province that we want. So this is just the beginning, and we're going to spend some time, we're in conversation about circling back and saying, okay, what's next? How do we turn this into action? How do we ensure that this isn't just another conversation? How do we take the best ideas that turned up in Halifax, for example, about a new politics and a new attitude and a new role for business and a more welcoming Nova Scotia? How do we turn that into action and build something really rich and dynamic? So at a macro level, this is the way that Engage is trying to engage Nova Scotians. But it's not just at a macro level. We're doing things at a regional level as well. This is a map that highlights Cumberland County. And there's a group called Cumberland County Life that was started by 6 business people in that community that says, look, Nova Scotians seem to think that the province, the same way that some of you might, too many people think that the province ends at the Causeway, or in their case, at the Cobequid Pass. As soon as you go through the toll booths, they feel more connected to New Brunswick in some ways than they do to Nova Scotia. And so they wanted to bring their community leaders together to sort of have a conversation about their future. So part of the work that we did at Engage at a more regional level is to bring together a facilitated discussion about what's the future. And we were hesitant about just engaging with business leaders because we said to them at the beginning, don't you think there's a wider community that you need to be in a conversation with than just you as business leaders? And they said, nope, it's just us. And so we tried to hide our facial expressions at the time, went out and sort of did a deep search about whether we should engage this because they didn't seem to have the full picture. In the end, we decided that we should, and that we trusted that if we do that, that they will see that there's a larger picture. And that's exactly what happened. At the end of this 4-hour facilitated business alpha-led exercise, the most dominant theme that came out of what they were talking about was that we need more people in the room. We need to have leaders from other parts, citizens from other parts of the community in this conversation. We're doing, and we're ready to do work like this in all different regions of the province as we continue to cycle it out and sort of catalyze. Our work is not to drive the activity. Our work is to create the conditions and support the capacity building to make this kind of thing happen. And the thing that perhaps we are amongst the things that we're most excited about when you take it from the macro Nova Scotia down to the regional Nova Scotia, where we're in the regions trying to help people to do it. Well, what about those people who have said, I want to make a difference, but I don't know what I can do as an individual? We started this initiative in Nova Scotia called Share Thanksgiving. And Share Thanksgiving is a fairly simple concept. And it means that in identifying the challenges that we have in being a welcoming Nova Scotia, is it possible every year at Thanksgiving time that for those people as individuals who say, what can I do, that we say back to them, you can welcome a new family or a new Nova Scotian, and this would be highly relevant for the growing population in Cape Breton as a result of CBU's demographics of welcoming people into their communities. Invite people to your home at Thanksgiving time, just to have supper, just to change the story, just to get to know each other. We didn't know what the result of this was going to be in the first year that we did it, but we're excited to report that after Toronto, we matched more families with more new Nova Scotians than any place in Canada. More than Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Montreal. Little old Nova Scotia that is presumed to be somewhat insular actually matched more families, which I think really goes to the sense of what it means to be a Nova Scotian. If we are given the ability and the possibility to express what's rich and deep about who we are as Nova Scotians, there are gifts galore that are just waiting to be shared with the rest of the world. So our challenge is around that capacity building building the opportunities for us to come together to get to know our new Nova Scotians better, finding new avenues for the exciting things to happen that really need to happen. Let me start to wrap, because I am getting tired of hearing myself a little bit, and talk a little bit about this part of our opinion research. And we asked Nova Scotians recently whether or not, was Nova Scotia is an excellent place to live, rated on a scale of 1 to 10. 27% of people say that it is an excellent place to live. 27%. I think that that's a phenomenal number. I'm not sure if you would get that kind of number matched anyplace else, and I think it's significant to see how many people sort of crowded at that end of the spectrum. This is a really strong indication of possibilities at an aggregate level. Here's where the rub comes. That when you break it down according to people's commitment, the biggest place where we see a differential is between those who are older Nova Scotians and younger Nova Scotians. Who are 55 and over, that number of 27% becomes 40%. Those between the ages of 35 and 18, it drops to 15%. So it might have seemed prophetic for Alexander Keith to tag the line, "Those who like it a lot." That was our slogan, you'll recall, for the beer that's most famous that comes from Nova Scotia, but that's in fact the way that young people, and it's not just young people, feel about Nova Scotia. And so the challenge that we have as Nova Scotians is to make sure that everybody's in this enterprise together. That we're all rowing together. And that we're not leaving too many people behind, because it's going to cost us dearly if we continue to leave behind, especially that group in the 20 to 30-year-old age group that continues to migrate to other parts of Canada. That is, if we're thinking about a projet national, it is that we have too many of our young people, particularly from Cape Breton, who are finding their way to continue to go down the road generation after generation. And there are strategic things that I think we are able to do, and we must do, to ensure that more people, particularly from that younger age group and some other groups that are often marginalized, see themselves as part of this. Otherwise, we're going to be like these guys in the boat, where you'll see that at one end, there's a group that is sort of bailing really hard because of the leak in the boat, and there's another group at the other end, perhaps the over 55s, who are saying, "Sure glad that hole isn't at our end." So this is a province of enormous potential. And my view is that we need to stop paying all of our attention to a focus about what's gone wrong, and instead begin to focus on what's possible. And if we begin not just to focus on what's possible, but we develop the capacity at a granular, at a dining room, kitchen table level, at a community level, and at a macro level, to see ourselves with greater capacity, greater ability, and to tap into that willingness, we will realize the potential that we have as Nova Scotia. It's on us, and we are the people we've been waiting for. So let's see what we can do to step up and make that happen. Thanks very much.